Super. So maybe just, this is very informal. We're all so thrilled for you to be here at our May Climate Cafe meeting, informal forum to discuss topical issues monthly. And as May is Asia Pacific AAPI month, we are going to talk about the devastating impact of climate change on the Pacific Islands today. And it would be nice, a lot of us know each other, but not everybody knows each other. So it would be nice to hear from some of you. So I'll first hand it to Angela, who's our communications director. Most of you must know her, but let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Angela Fobbs. I live in Germany and I vote in Florida, and the climate emergency and the environment are the most important issues for me. Nice to see everyone today.
Maybe we can hear from somebody we don't know, Josh Nakowitz, who just popped in. We're introducing ourselves. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Josh, and I'm in New Zealand. Some of the others of you might be as well. And I'm here with my mum, Nona.
Nona's son.
Yes, that's right.
And I understand you also have some very important and interesting information to share with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful.
Whitney Eisenhower.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. I'm Whitney. This is my first time joining one of these. I live in Samoa, so I'm in the Pacific Island region, and I vote in North Carolina. And the environment is up there with a top issue for me, along with healthcare. So that's partly why I'm attending today.
So glad you could join us today.
Yeah.
And Andrew?
Hello, everyone. So I'm Andrew Irvin. I'm with the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport. I've been based out of Fiji for the last 10 years, working in conservation with IUCN for 5, and then on transport issues for the last 3.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. And America, with your lovely underwater background.
Hey, I was there. I was on the other side of that turtle when that picture got taken. So, yeah, that was taken up near Namena Island in the Vatui Passage, and it's a protected marine reserve. And one of the things that was so amazing diving there was seeing how different it was in the marine reserve versus some of the other areas, especially the areas that were closer to the larger islands, and felt a lot more impact from shipping and from fishing. So, but I'm super glad to be here. And I'm actually here to listen to Andrew, because even though we both live in Suva, every time I've heard him speak, I'm just like, wow, there's so much I have to learn from you. So I'm tickled pink that he's here.
I can't figure out how to make this work.
Maybe you can.
I'm listed as iPad.
And Nona will, I'm so happy that she could join us from New Zealand. She's going to be one of our headline speakers today, even though this is an informal forum. But Nona, maybe you could introduce yourself first.
Yep. Hi, I'm Nona Morris. We've been living in New Zealand for the last 27 years. And both my kids are born and raised here. So my husband was originally from Connecticut, and I'm sort of from a range of places. Prior to living in New Zealand, we lived in Nepal. Prior to that, I was in Kenya, and prior to that, I was in Liberia. So I haven't actually lived a lot of years in the United States. I did a lot of my schooling elsewhere in other parts of the world. I work with a nonprofit charitable organization called Earth Diverse. That is a platform for sharing diversity knowledge, for capturing and sharing it. Particularly, it's a community-based organization, and our aim is to make information around cultural and environmental diversity knowledge accessible to the community. Yeah, that's a bit about us.
Amazing,
and my son Josh, you just met him.
Hearing your presentation shortly. Let's move on.
Yeah, well, Josh and I was just going to say, Dana, Josh and I just co-wrote it, but it's quite an introductory, general overview piece. So, just sort of letting you know. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a choice of 2 pieces or that.
Pardon? Isa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Isa Koker. I live in Istanbul. I'm almost 80 years old. I'm a 100% disabled veteran. I've been working for climate catastrophe stuff since the 1960s, one way or another. And my degrees are in anthropology and applied linguistics, and I'm a photographer writer.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Isa. Delighted to
Thank
have
you.
And John, our new DNC rep, you want to tell us where you're calling in from? And
yeah, sure. My name is John Baumlin. I am the DNC representative for Asia Pacific. I vote in New Jersey, and I'm living just outside of Tokyo. So I hope to learn a lot today about the Pacific Islands, and I'm really grateful to Dana and the ECCC and DA Finland for hosting an event. So thank you guys so much.
And Inga, how about you? Our peers.
Hi, I'm Inga Kemtrup. I am former chair of DA UK. I'm in London, which is on sort of an island that has absolutely no idea what's going to be happening to it. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. I also have to say I'm kind of working on filling out my California ballot today, which I have to send in 2 weeks. And if you are voting in things, yes, now's the time. These primaries are going to be crucial, and we have to let our representatives know that we care about this stuff. So thank you for being here. Really looking forward to it.
Have I gotten to everybody who's here now? Michael, did you introduce Michelle? She can't hear me.
Hi, sorry, I didn't introduce myself, and I didn't realize I was in mute earlier, so you got to hear about how I bought too much celery. That's when you said, excuse me. I'm kind of lurking a little bit because we're in the middle of cooking dinner. I'm in Japan. I live in Nagoya, and Angela very sweetly invited me. I don't have any direct connection to the Environment and Climate Crisis
That's okay.
Council at all.
We're so happy to have you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, guys.
We are all here to learn and to share. Did we hear from Christine?
Hi, sorry, I'm also in Japan, down in Kyushu, and I'm in the middle of eating dinner and you don't want to see.
Okay.
So,
I probably would if it's Japanese food. With all those wonderful hot springs nearby.
Yes. So I'm very grateful. Thank you. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to learn more about the Pacific Islands. I teach kids in Japan about various issues, and climate is one of the topics that we discuss. So I always am grateful for any opportunities to learn more so that I can pass on that information to the kids that I teach. So thank you very much for today.
Good. So glad to hear that. And thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everybody know that the ECCC has passed at the global meeting this past Sunday, a resolution on the climate emergency, which includes a petition which will be signed and disseminated not just worldwide, but all over the United States as well, to be sent to Congress and the White House, asking that there be a climate emergency declared. So it was passed nearly unanimously, the resolution, and we worked hard on it. We're all really pleased, and we hope that it amounts to something that it makes a difference. So I wanted to share that with everybody. Thank Inga and all the members of the ECCC that contributed to drafting the resolution, and thanks to all the DPCA voters who voted nearly unanimously to pass the resolution. So on that, I will remind everybody present once again to make sure that you are registered to vote, because though things look bad, there will be no change. There will certainly be no measures in government to address climate change under a Republican regime. We face an uphill battle. The times could not be more dire. We have basically until 2025 to keep the rise in temperatures below 1.5. There's no time to spare. So one of the most powerful tools we have is our vote. So please make sure you're registered, participate in your primaries, make sure that the greenest candidates are those that are winning the primaries, and above all, make sure you vote in the midterms, up and down the ballot, because we see in all of the states that state legislatures have a profound impact on state legislation. So, okay, let's move on to our program for today. So with that, I'd like to introduce Nona and Josh, who are in New Zealand, but work in the climate space and have interesting things to report on what New Zealand is doing to prepare for this onslaught and what's going on the ground in the Pacific Islands. And if Andrew shows up, oh, Andrew is here. I see that Andrew, our other speaker, we'll introduce him in a minute. Andrew, can you hear me?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, I'm glad you made it. Why don't you quickly introduce yourself? We've been introducing each other. Oh, you're Andrew.
Yep, it's me.
Okay, I didn't make the connection. So you're America's Andrew. That is wonderful.
Exactly.
So you did introduce yourself. So we'll have Nona and Josh making a presentation first, and then we will hear from you. I'm sorry, I did not make the connection.
No worries. At least I'm here.
You are here. I didn't get a reconfirmation, so I was a little bit worried, and we are really delighted that you came today. With that, I will now turn it over to Nona and Josh.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Where is... Sorry, just trying to get this thing going, and got to get this out of the way. Okay. Okay, Josh, are you on?
Yep, although the presentation isn't what you expected to see.
Josh, what's that? Do you want to, Josh?
Yes.
Sorry, we're doing this from two different cities, so we're just trying to coordinate ourselves a little bit here. Josh, do you know how to get the notes on from the thing?
Yeah, why don't you stop sharing and I'll try sharing it.
Okay.
So we're just getting your whole screen. But anyway, nice to meet you all. It's fun that it's an informal session. I haven't been part of one before, been part of this group before, but it seems like a fun time. Here we go.
Yeah, so I'm located in central North Island, and Josh is at the bottom of the North Island and in Wellington, where he works. Is it coming up? Yeah, there we go.
Unfortunately, I'm having problems too.
Zoom, Josh.
You're having problems too.
Yeah, it's not going to let me.
If you want
That's
to,
right.
if
It'll
you
work.
want to send me the presentation, I could show it for you if you want. Is that?
I'm seeing it, Joshi. It's just not coming up for you, or what's happening?
No, it's not on the screen.
No, it's not on
No, my screen's not sharing. Oh, well, you can go back to what you're doing. That was fine.
All right, shall I just share mine, Josh?
Yeah, that'll be fine. As my mom was starting to say, I work now at the Ministry for the Environment, which I've been enjoying. And we were going to talk just a little bit about some of the impacts of climate change in the Pacific. I think for many of you, you'll be familiar with all this. You'll know sort of what that looks like. But we can run through some things anyway. Yeah.
Joshie Love, can you just if you just cut and paste in the thing to me in the notes, I'll be able to catch it if you just send it to my phone. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, just shoot it to my phone, and then I've got what's happening in the thing, and I will hit share. Sorry, we haven't trialed this, and it's well past 10 p.m. here, so share screen play. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Great. All right, so Josh, if you just shoot the note to me on text, that would be helpful. Joshie?
Yep, I'm working on it. Carry on.
Okay. Well, kia ora, everybody. So we do have some Pacific Islanders here in the group, so that's great. And one of the things that, as we've already said, we live in New Zealand, which, as you can see, is for those of you that are familiar with the region, is the absolute southernmost corner of the Polynesian Triangle. So New Zealand, or is known here, Aotearoa, is the biggest island in island nation in the Polynesian Triangle. And consequently, we act as the safety net for our Pacific nation neighbors as they face the consequences of climate change. So let's start with a look at the Pacific region. The Pacific Island region covers an area of more than 27 million square kilometers. But from the perspective of the continents and from the perspective of the large global powers, there is a tendency to see the Pacific Ocean as a vast body of water with a handful of tiny islands dotting through the vast sea. So the idea that is often there is that these islands are isolated and that they're dependent on resources and assistance from the larger economies in the world. This view is really important to understand because it's very relevant to climate change. And this view informs how Pacifica people are treated, and more specifically in the post-European contact period, how they are ignored. This is an important idea to keep in mind in the context of climate change and the impacts and how this impacts the daily lives of the people in Oceania. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this perspective. Where's my slide gone? Here we go. You will notice that we have used two terms, okay? Pacific Islands and Oceania. These words, we're good there, Joshi. These words are significant because they denote something, and they cause us to view the region from different perspectives. It is, you will find that the term Pacific Island populates the language of Anglophone economists, corporate bodies, lawmakers, and developers. The term Pacific Islands is used most commonly throughout all of these bodies of discourse, but it denotes small islands, small dots of land in a vast body of water. It establishes the idea that these small bits of land are too small to have any resources and that they're too isolated to have a significant economy. It also creates the notion that these places are of less importance and of less value than the continental masses. And we saw that, this undervalued notion, regularly with nuclear bomb testing by the USA in the Marshall Islands in the 40s and the 50s, and by testing by France from the 1960s right through to the 90s. So now let's look at Oceania. First off, Oceania is recognized as more than a collection of little island dots. It is made up of 3 significant types of land masses: larger continental islands of Australia, Papua New Guinea, and New Zealand, and thousands of low islands and high islands. Low referring to atolls, and high islands referring to volcanic cones. Sorry, just. Josh, I'm not quite sure what happened to my thing here. Just having some technology difficulties right now. Josh, your whole thing has just disappeared. Gosh. Sorry, guys. We are just having all kinds of technology problems right now.
Can you still control the slides?
I'm trying. Something's happened to it. And your thing, I'm just going to turn off this thing and start over.
Thanks for the comment, Isa. What happens in the Pacific literally impacts everywhere. And you're absolutely right. The Pacific Ocean is so vast and touches so much of the world and is so important to all the climactic patterns, for one thing, and socially as well. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that everything that happens in this region is definitely globally important. One thing I think that's interesting though is that it tends to be, I think it's easily forgotten, is sort of the point there. So we can see how important we are and how like interconnected the region is globally. But I think for many people in the US and other northern continents, it's easy to forget. And that's a strange experience.
Great, thanks, Josh. So, like I said, we've got Pacific Islands, which denotes small dots of islands in a vast sea, whereas Oceania is a term that denotes a sea of islands with their inhabitants. In the Sea of Islands, there are many resources, and they are island inhabitants. The main thing is that they have the island inhabitants of these areas do not see themselves as limited by boundaries of their particular island. In fact, they see as part of their scape, their lifescape. There's the sea and all of the resources under the sea and the navigational abilities that are provided by the sky is all part of their world. So they see their world as vast. They're not limited by the coastal boundary of their island. And that's a really important thing because that's not how the predominant European and main global powers view these islands. So they have many resources, and these resources are traded through extensive trading routes. And through these extensive trading routes, they have created a very vibrant economy. They have vast inter-island networks. And these networks are ones that have been established over generations and generations, in which, for example, you might have somebody in say Papua New Guinea, or these marriages, you know, will consolidate a relationship between two different communities, and that contributes to the trading capacity. These kinship links bond the communities together over generations. So again, the important thing is that the peoples of Oceania don't see themselves as living on little isolated little spots that protrude from the sea. They see themselves as part of this vast network in which the sea is a part of the space in which they inhabit. The sea is so important to them that many of their gods and their mythical creatures live within the sea as well. So these are really key parts of the cultures and the inhabitants of the area. But this is not the perspective with which they're treated. And this is, like I said, an important idea to keep in mind when we look at climate change. Okay, so what do we got here? People traveling, these are the original style of wakas. The waka is the Maori term for the double-hulled canoe that was used to navigate the original inhabitants to New Zealand or Aotearoa from an area approximately around Tahiti. So you'll all be familiar with the field of environmental justice. And one of the key understandings is that in almost all cases, the impacts of environmental degradation are felt most severely by the most vulnerable populations and those who have the least power to change the system or stand up to the polluters. And this is especially true for climate change in Oceania. So we find that the Pacific Island nations produce just 0.20% of global emissions, but are among the most severely impacted by climate change. Now I'm going to hand this over to Josh, and he's going to talk a bit about the specific impacts that are felt.
Yeah, thanks. And Andrew, thanks for sending the link to that article. If everyone has the time, that's a wonderful article. That's exactly what we were referring to. That captures really eloquently that difference in perspective. So the main impacts of climate change are the same things that are happening around the world, but I think there might be fair to say that they're felt especially strongly across Oceania. So things like sea level rise are a huge threat to the safety of these low-lying islands, or especially the low-lying islands that are essential to survival. Many islands across Oceania are low-lying coral atolls. They're only a few meters tall at the highest point in many cases, and often very narrow as well. On the next slide, I got a picture of the Marshall Islands, which is sort of classically small land mass. And so sea level rise in the shoreline, the coastline is inundated by seawater. For islands like this, there's nowhere else to go. And the crucial land that's there for growing crops or sources of fresh water are threatened by saltwater intrusion as the sea level comes closer in. And ultimately, the island may well become uninhabitable. And that's what's happening now in a lot of places. For example, in the Solomon Islands, in the past 20 years, there's been a huge uptick in extreme weather events of greater intensity, which is another expected impact of climate change that we're seeing across the Pacific now. Sea levels have risen about 15 centimeters there, past the historical average, which may not sound like much, but for a low-lying island, that little bit, 15 centimeters of vertical rise, can cover a significant amount of land. And for islands like you see there, they can easily just disappear completely. And I guess the point of that is for people living, for the people who live across the ocean, climate change is not as abstract as it is for people in the US and in the continents. It's impossible to ignore because it's happening now and they face it every day. One of the other impacts that's having a big effect is ocean acidification. And I won't spend too long describing the process, but the ocean is becoming more acidic, and that is due to the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It transfers into the ocean and forms carbonic acid, and that's a threat for a few different reasons. It is a big problem for all the marine life. Shellfish and corals rely on very delicate levels of carbon in the water, and they filter carbonate out of the water to produce their shells, and that's becoming less available, so their shells are becoming thinner, and the increasing acidification of the oceans is corrosive and dissolves them. So we're seeing coral die off and really fragile populations of marine life. And the result of all this is, of course, an immense disruption in the food chain. The coral reefs across the Pacific Ocean are home to immense biodiversity, and the loss of these ecosystems, which we are seeing now, is hard to quantify, but a lot of reports and the experiences of people in Oceania, these communities can tell us that the impact of these losses is catastrophic. Another key impact of climate change that is having a big impact is just the increase in ocean temperature. So you may know the ocean absorbs a lot of the sun's energy and is an important stabilizer for the climate system. About 90% of the Earth's warming in the last 50 years has taken place in the ocean, with a big proportion of that, maybe 60%, at the ocean surface, and then another 30% in deep water. And effectively, that means the ocean has buffered the atmospheric warming that we've experienced so far and absorbed a lot of that heat. but that's not going to last forever. And the rate of ocean warming is increasing rapidly. And ultimately, this stored heat will re-enter the system through melting ice caps, evaporation, or reheating the atmosphere. And the warmer water is another threat to all life in marine ecosystems, because it's changed much, much faster than really anything can adapt to. The pictures here are of southern bull kelp forests, which are a key habitat for supporting marine animal populations. And alarmingly, they're dying off rapidly around the coastlines due to marine heat waves. So these are just some more pictures of the biodiversity loss and the habitat loss that's happening in the ocean. What's at stake is the livelihood and food security and economies of these places. Oceania's people have a really close connection with ocean resources for their way of life. And so island nations with extensive coral reef habitats are extremely vulnerable to ocean acidification and temperature increase and increasing frequency and intensity of storms. And on the next slide, again, just list some of the ways in which they'll be affected. Reefs and fisheries provide food security and livelihoods. I jumped ahead a little bit, but on the next slide. Oh yeah. Cyclones. We can go back. Warmer water temperatures.
Can you talk a little bit about, Ashley, can you go through a bit about the paua and the crayfish and why that's significant in New Zealand? Are you able to get the notes?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for paua and crayfish. Paua is also known as abalone. Is that colorful shellfish? They're important foundation. These are both important foundational species, which control the local marine biodiversity. They're like keystone species that help support the health of the whole ecosystem and provide food and habitat to other species, which are economically important in New Zealand and culturally important to indigenous Maori. So the loss of these species will be devastating. And we've seen huge decline.
One thing that we need to add about the paua and the crayfish here in New Zealand is that we're experiencing a lot of die-off of the southern bull kelp, which populates a lot of the coastline. And both of these species are heavily reliant on the bull kelp forests. The bull kelp, we're just seeing rotting masses of it lining up some of the beaches thanks to the marine heat waves, and already in some of the areas it's become locally extinct. So it is a significant problem, and again, being a small nation sitting in the Pacific Ocean, we are being impacted very, very in a very visible manner. It's hard to miss when your beaches are covered in rotting kelp thanks to the warming climate, warming oceans. Oh, man. Okay. You've got Sheila?
So on cyclones, warmer water temperatures are contributing to a more intense climate system, more intense and more frequent tropical storms that are damaging to island infrastructure. And I think media has kept much of the world well informed about increasingly violent and destructive cyclones that have struck the Pacific and but victims of cyclones not only suffer from flooding and loss of home and land and livelihoods, they're also more vulnerable to diseases and other health consequences. The impacts of the changing climate are so far-reaching. And here's some of the key things that are threatened for the people. Yeah, as I was saying before, Oceania's people are deeply connected to ocean resources for all these things: food security, livelihoods, economies, and important cultural connections to marine environments and animals. So island nations are extremely vulnerable to all these impacts.
What's wrong with this thing?
Assessments have suggested that some of the most vulnerable locations are the ones you see there: Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Papua New Guinea, Federated States of Micronesia, Tonga, and Tuvalu. Oh, yes. Oh, that's handy. Papua New Guinea,
Federated States of Micronesia,
Tonga, and Tuvalu.
Some of the reasons that these particular ones are at the highest level of vulnerability has to do with the fact that they are surrounded quite extensively by coral reefs, and those coral reefs are degrading at a very rapid rate. As mentioned by Josh earlier, due to ocean acidification, but also due to the ocean warming. With the warmer oceans, there's a significant bleaching of the corals, and so therefore die off. And there's been, at least in the last less than 10 years, 3 major die-off events of corals. So those are the most critical ones, but that doesn't mean the others are less, the other areas around these oceanic territories are equally, they are as vulnerable. They just happen to be often like volcanic areas or things like that, and not as reef dependent. So what will people do as their homes are threatened? Josh, you'll have to either send me the notes for that or...
Well, we know climate change hazards globally have caused extensive humanitarian crises and forced people to move both within their own countries and internationally. One figure we found is that hazards exacerbated by climate change displaced around 20 million people in 2018. And it's also clear that climate change is affecting every one of the approximately 14 million people across the Pacific. But I think the more important or better question to ask is, what do these communities want? Interestingly, New Zealand trialed a climate refugee visa program in 2017, and ultimately stopped it because of what they found was that people don't really want to leave their homes as refugees. They want to protect them. And that means we need to do sort of 2 key things: reduce emissions. Larger countries must reduce their emissions and should be supporting local adaptation efforts. Well, yes, thanks for that comment too. Andrew can speak to what infrastructure changes need to be made to deal with the effects. I'm looking forward to Andrew's talk. Yeah, that would be.
Can you just mention a bit more about what New Zealand has discovered about migration pathways?
Yeah, in terms of migration pathways, that's sort of a last resort, I think. Providing opportunities to migrate with dignity should be developed for countries that and people that are looking to move. And that means having, communities and support and employment sort of available to them, because climate refugee status is not desirable. Long story short.
Yeah. So one of the solutions, one of the types of things that is happening, for instance, in Kiribati, the leadership of Kiribati has been trying to, for example, purchase land in countries such as Fiji to provide basically places for communities who are absolutely going underwater to move to. But again, as Josh mentioned, the idea is to move with dignity, not to come as sort of hapless refugees and kind of begging or needing something. They want to be able to, if they have to move, they want to be able to move and continue to live their way of life and not be dependent upon the host nation. So that's a critical part of the idea if migration needs to happen, and we know it will, because some of these islands are just not going to be able to stay above water long enough. Sorry, there's a moo going on. So that's from us. We just wanted to give you an overview. There's so much to be said about the issues facing Oceania. It's a massive, massive territory, and it's hard to touch on everything, but we thought we'd just touch on the absolutely most critical impact areas and try to just give little snippets and examples of some of the ways in which those particular impacts are hitting these different areas. So hopefully that was helpful, just to kind of, for people who don't live in the area, to kind of get a glimpse of what's happening in Oceania, but also to take on that viewpoint that it is Oceania and not Pacific Islands, with that concept that the people of this area don't see themselves as small and isolated and economically dependent. They in fact see themselves as big. And the language, if you speak some of these languages, the language reflects that concept of large, vastness. Their gods are big. Their mythology is large. The stories and the things that their gods, and that comes with that sense as part of a vast space, not part of a tiny little island dot. And as I mentioned before, the rest of the world doesn't see them as tiny dots, therefore insignificant, therefore easy to ignore, and easy to do your nuclear tests in their area because they're not that important. And we just need to help the rest of the world.
What an important distinction. What an important distinction, Nona. I think if we all come away with that, it will be critically important for today. And obviously, we have advertised this event as the Pacific Islands. And so we have been tone deaf to that as well. So I thank you very much for that important piece of information and education. I have a question for you, and then I want to open it up for a few minutes for if people have specifically questions for you before I give Andrew the floor. But you talked about what New Zealand was doing to prepare for the onslaught of climate refugees. And I was wondering if you could speak to that for a minute or two, if you would.
Again, New Zealand's role in a lot of different ways has been to assist with adaptations. A lot of the islands are, the members of certain island areas already are New Zealand citizens, so they are free to move back and forth. And if they aren't, there's a lot of, there's a number of different island nations that have the ability to come and go. So we do have large Pacifica communities in New Zealand. There are large Samoan, Tongan, Tuvalu, Tokelau, Cook Islander Maori, Solomon Islanders, very large groups of Fijians, both Fijian Indians and indigenous Fijians. Very, very big communities already here. And so the ability for people to come in and mesh into the community is not that difficult. Their cultural roles, their languages and so forth are very supported here, so they can continue with the lifestyle. So we're kind of in a unique space for that, but there have been, as Josh mentioned, the study that was done as to what do they want was that they want to stay. They want to stay put where they are to the best of their ability. So that means helping innovate adaptations. One such adaptation, for example, was to help build up their freshwater fisheries dependence, a dependence on freshwater fisheries, as opposed to marine fisheries where you're getting high die-off of the species they might have been reliant on before. And that freshwater fishery, for example, would then mean developing aquaculture systems. That's an example of an adaptation that could be introduced to help those communities stay where they are. But at the top of the list is reducing emissions so we can stop drowning these islands.
So I'm going to ask you, Noni, to stop sharing your screen so that we can see each other. And I think Christine had a question in the chat she would like to ask you.
Hi, thank you so much. That was very educational for me in terms of not only the actual terms being used for not Pacific Islands, but focusing more on Oceania, as well as the actual environmental impacts on the ground. I tend to focus more on political maneuvering, I guess is probably a better way to say it. So I really was happy to see the actual environmental impacts that are happening in the area. So one of the things I wanted to ask was the examples that you gave, are they reversible, or have we come to the point where we're just saying it's not reversible? So really only the focus is on adaptation rather than mitigation?
Anyone else is welcome to jump in here. But I think most of the impacts that we're seeing now are essentially irreversible and sort of locked in terms of the amount of carbon we've got in the atmosphere has already caused these impacts, and it's sort of held, that extra energy is just held in the system. Like that ocean warming is going to keep playing out for
Diana, did you have
centuries.
To add?
Well, let Josh finish first. You might be saying the same thing.
Possibly. Both are key. Mitigation can stop making it worse, and adaptation can help us adapt to the situation we got now. Yeah, I think we really need to prioritize them both.
It's not possible to reverse, for example, ocean acidification. We've already made the ocean too acidic. And so now it's a case of one of the adaptations that's been suggested by some of the researchers here, for example, is to try and find the species that might be more tolerant of a lower pH and to help propagate them, things like that. But we can't make the ocean more alkaline. We've gone past that point.
Yeah. Sea level rise is also in the pipeline for a long time. So that will be hard to reverse even after we stop emissions.
Right. So it's a bit of a doomsday answer.
Bruce, did you have a question?
Thank you both for your presentations. I'm on a learning curve too. I have two questions. One, I've been focusing on mitigation for a long time, and I'm understanding more how in your region adaptation is also really important. I'm wondering about regenerative ocean farming, kelp, and it was saddening to see some of the kelp rotting in one of those images. And I have this vision for kelp helping with carbon sequestration. And I'm wondering if that is something that is being promoted right now. The second question has to do with Australia and its unwillingness to phase out coal. And I want that to happen. And I'm wondering if the people in the Pacific region also are trying to encourage Australia, come on, to phase out coal.
Well, with the new president, Albanese, our prime minister in Australia, maybe there is some hope, who was elected this weekend, who's run on a climate platform. So let's keep our fingers crossed about that.
That was my thought as well. There might be hope.
There might be hope. Yeah, because otherwise the voices of the island nations are not being heard by the larger powers of Australia, certainly not. New Zealand is phasing out coal. Our dependence on coal is going down. Some of the plants have been shut. And so there's a positive there, but New Zealand has always been more reliant on hydroelectric power. That's the bulk of the bulk of electricity is produced by hydroelectric.
Thank you so much, Nona and Josh. I'd really like to give the floor to Andrew for a few minutes, who is coming to us from Fiji with a long experience in these issues, and I'm sure that he will contribute richly to this discussion and to our perspective. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And Nona and Josh, thank you for all of the preparatory information, because I was wondering how many of these bullet points I would have to hit, but it seems like you've covered the bases pretty well. So yeah, I mean, I guess given the nature of this meeting and the discussion then becomes, what do we do now? What do we do from a policy standpoint? How do we help the Pacific community at large, ameliorate the effects of climate change, prepare for it, and plan and position for mitigation of the worst and adaptation to what we know is going to be coming down the pipeline? Because yeah, like this is locked in. Like this is, we are, without significant large-scale reforestation efforts, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, and then to a degree, we're going to see people exploring all sorts of geoengineering options over the next 30 years as people get more and more desperate about solutions. So it's going to be an interesting geopolitical and technological dialogue and development process that we're seeing, across various technologies, in terms of electrification, hydrogen production, ammonia production, all of these alternative fuels and fuel media that we will require. It's figuring out how we are going to basically decarbonize our entire energy system as rapidly as possible. I know I can say from my experience with, working with governments in the region, we know, like there are countries like the Marshall Islands, they're a clear canary in the coal mine. They've been yelling about this for the last decade to everyone that will listen. And we just get a tepid response out of the US and the EU and other developed Western nations who are not sitting on a little sandbar cusp of land surrounded by the sea, watching it rise. Just quick show of hands, who's been out on an atoll? Okay, Dana. No. Dana, which atoll have you had the opportunity to visit?
It was, gosh, I don't remember the name of it. It was out towards the Solomon Islands.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, once you're in that experience and you're just surrounded by ocean on either side of you, you can see the immediacy of the threat. If anything is disturbed, if, we have rocked the boat. We have, tipped the bowl, and we are out of alignment right now. And, we've seen it with the jet stream being disrupted and the incredible variances in the Northern Hemisphere and winter weather over the last, decade in particular. It's just intensifying. We are pushing beyond these boundaries. And for, especially Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Wallis and Futuna, Tokelau, we know that right now they are in this acceptable losses sacrifice zone as per Western development policy. And this is not the first time that, the United States has done this. They still have not properly apologized for nuking, the Marshallese during peacetime, basically committing war crimes during peacetime. So, I mean, these are all from a messaging and policy perspective, means of addressing the needs of the climate most vulnerable states over, the course of future policy planning for the United States. So since I think, Christine, you mentioned you were more interested in the politics side of this, I'm very much, and I always have to make that distinction, not really into the politics of it, but the policy of it is very important to me. And from a standpoint of, I know, Josh, you mentioned the infrastructure discussion, what we need in terms of, let me see if I can share screen briefly. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I just wanted to illustrate with a map how things have changed. There we go. Is this working, everyone?
Yes.
Can you see the map?
Yes.
Yep.
So you can see all of those different villages around the perimeter of Vanuatu, Viti Levu, all of the outer islands. I guess reading them all isn't very important right now, but just noticing the difference in how few of them there are today in terms of maritime island connectivity, how resources end up getting centralized in capital cities as a consequence of the resource pressures that are experienced and the influence of market economics on these island environments, which will never generate economies of scale. It's like basically building, expecting, like in South Dakota, building a administrative center and shopping center in one place, and everyone flocks towards that. We have terrestrial islands in the United States. I was just discussing landlocked developing states with folks online earlier. So these will never be economically viable communities in the existing market paradigm. So the way that the United States views its relationship with a lot of these islands is in terms of geopolitical strategy and how it can utilize for staging purposes and trade purposes. And so, for instance, that's one of the opportunities that we can help, emphasize through whatever messaging comes from Democrats abroad, is saying, okay, well, there are all these opportunities for trade facilitation and technology transfer and upskilling and training, like all of the North Pacific free association states under the compact, Palau, FSM, Marshall Islands. They all have provisions under the Jones Act that they reference in their own maritime law, for instance, and it impedes the way that vessels can trade under the traditional mechanisms. I mean, this is Fiji, and this was also after colonial contact, but these systems that were in place for small scale exchange between the islands have broken down almost entirely. And that's one of the pieces of research that I've been looking at for the last few years. And it's one of the areas in which the United States can be more proactive, forward-thinking leader and provide that level of support to these countries. And, I don't know who's following closely the situation in the Solomon Islands right now geopolitically in terms of their recent, in the last few years, transition from diplomatic relationships with Taiwan to mainland China. And how in the last, 12 months, because of economic pressures, they are making additional diplomatic concessions. And I was, discussing this with others online regarding the opportunity for, it's a nation where the entire GDP is $1.5 billion. Any number of research institutions would be able to fund reforestation efforts across all of the Solomon Islands, looking at the anthropological and geographical needs, and fund that sort of complete replacement of GDP from mostly logging extraction that goes to China with a restoration plan. And it would be a drop in the bucket, a fraction of what they're delivering to the Ukraine for military aid. So that could replace the economy of the Solomons, which is not one of the small countries in the region. So, this is where there are opportunities for this kind of complete paradigm shift, conservation-oriented, restoration-oriented development planning for Pacific Island states and Oceania as a region that's under assault right now. And when I was at IUCN, the phrase "lungs of the earth" kept coming up. It is where so much of the oxygen is generated. We know most of it. It's marine algae and other photosynthesizing life forms, not terrestrial forests, that generates the bulk of our oxygen. So, stripping out the pelagic, interpelagic zones, we're just disrupting everything. I know a number of you are in Japan. You know how a bowl of miso soup settles, and I was just thinking about that. We've been in the Holocene, and the soup has been settled long enough for all of us to build farms and proliferate, and we have gotten to the point where we are bubbling at the surface to the point where it has mixed up the miso, and we are in an environment that is no longer what we emerged in. So that is us in the Anthropocene. We have exited the Holocene, and we have to deal with it in a different manner. I could rant about this for hours. I don't know how much time everyone else has. It's after 11 here, so I can take questions and open it up and make it informal now, if that's better for everyone.
Wow, thank you so much, Andrew. Can I ask if you could tell us in more detail what you have been working with there, and what brought you to Fiji, and what you have been working with there? I think that would be interesting for us.
So it's funny because I moved down here because my wife is from Fiji, and we met when I was in college, and she moved back and said, "Hey, come to Fiji." And so I did. So I'm not an expat. I technically emigrated. So I did, I came down here and I had a media background, and I tried working with some of the telecommunications companies here, and it was a really miserable experience. And then I started working with IUCN, which was a wonderful experience. And for those who aren't familiar, it's the International Union for Conservation of Nature. It was founded around in 1948 at the same time, adjacent to the UN agencies, but with a focus on the conservation efforts specifically oriented away from human development. So that's I think it was addressed during the presentation previously. Nona, Josh covered it. The biodiversity loss. This is something, even if we are able to, curb our fossil fuel use and start sequestering carbon and bring it back down to under 300 parts per million, it will not undo the extinction level event that's happening right now. We cannot get back what we have pruned off of the tree of life. That is not coming back. We have to ameliorate that as quickly as possible. And it means much more ambitious targets than anything either mainstream party is dealing with. We are so far off of that path that we're being taken down from a policy standpoint right now. It's night and day. So, yeah.
In Oceania, in terms of the reef, can there be any good news? We do hear reports about seeding of the reefs to try to bring some success, trying to bring certain areas back to life. Are there emerging technologies which can address this in terms of mitigating it to a certain extent?
Yes, this is one of those things where, yes, we're seeing there are mechanisms that work for bringing things back and restoring certain types of ecosystems and finding out which anchor species will draw what other species are still within the ecosystem. Yes, but it's one of those instances where, you've been thrown off balance and you're trying to get back on balance, but someone keeps pushing you. And it doesn't matter if we have these mechanisms, these pilot sites where we see that there are victories being achieved at local levels, but you can't fight against that scale of a tide. We are pushed beyond those bound. Is anyone familiar with Johann Rockström and the planetary boundaries theories? And we haven't even talked about the nitrogen cycle, but yeah, I mean, there are all of these boundaries that we have pushed beyond as a species, and we have to contract at this point in a lot of key consumptive dimensions. So yeah, yes, there is good news if we change all of the other stuff that's throwing off those rays of hope.
Would somebody have a question for Andrew or for Nona or Josh? Thoughts, frustrations, tears? Bruce?
It's a question for everyone. At COP26, there was a renewed pledge to invest $100 billion annually, saying that really, 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 we are going to start in 2023. I'm wondering if people in your region are talking about that, maybe also being asked how to best spend those resources when they are delivered. And if any of you have a personal opinion about how they could be used wisely to accelerate mitigation and also take care of necessary adaptation. Andrew, would you like to start?
So sorry, what was that specifically? What takes care of the necessary mitigation and adaptation? I missed.
100 million, I think, was for adaptation, not for mitigation.
100 million?
Billion.
I'm referring to the COP26.
Yeah, that was for adaptation.
The COP26 pledge for a 100 billion annual investment.
Annual investment, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I'm saying is for a 100 billion, you invest 1.5 of that into basically turning a country like the Solomon Islands into a conservation area, just allowing them to meet their subsistence agriculture demands, study and both in partnership with and at local institutions with international institutions. It's basically building up human capacity, education, health. You could take like $100 billion would enable all extractive activities and, large scale fossil fuel consuming activities to stop in a lot of these countries. $100 billion per annum covers all of their GDP. Like there's just a mismatch in scale and application. And it's not about aid dependence. It's about how do you realign and restart the dialogue on how an economy can run and what you expect out of it. We cannot keep extracting from Pacific Island states. We're already, we talk a lot about how people carve up the pie and who's getting what size of a slice of pie. We, over time, have eaten all the pie already, and we're all fighting over the pieces of crust stuck at the end. So, yeah, $100 billion would make all the difference depending on how it's allocated across the region.
David, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Hi. Yeah. Sorry. I've got you guys on the background here while I'm doing something else, but it's quite interesting, and I posed that possibly rather naive question in the chat box about Andrew. I take your point about how the U.S. has left the region in the lurch in many ways, and that's why I said cynically at the beginning, because sometimes you have to. I think the thing that will actually get the U.S. to act on it is cynically looking at it, is some sort of geopolitical interest that means that they take an interest in this region in that regard. And I don't know if there is a way to do that, or if that's a smart road to go down. To what extent has anyone pursued that avenue, I suppose?
You mean since the Marshall Plan, or yeah, I mean,
yeah, color me ignorant. Sorry.
No, I mean, it's just, you know, it's this, we're talking about this at the scale, like I mentioned earlier, the 40 billion committed for military aid to Ukraine. What 40 billion does is covers, you know, every country with the exception of, with PNG as well. So all of the region's annual GDP. Like if you're looking, matching the scale across the region, there are so few people spread out to do so many things. Like I remember talking with the government of Kiribati, the environment ministry up there, about trying to undertake the red listing exercise, a national red listing exercise of the, you know, species, the extent of occurrence, area of occupancy for this enormous EZ, like the highest per capita area to population in the world. And just that kind of exercise is not possible without enormous resource consumption. But so that means instead of having to undertake that exercise, conserving it and leaving it alone, because we cannot understand well enough the damage that we would do. So that is my, you know, precautionary principle coming into play. Okay. And I think that is what the Pacific position from the United States side should be: conserve, protect, and stop extracting. This is not enough, you know, like the seabed mining discussions are horrifying. We can't control tailings dams from leaking on land. Why would we expect to be able to stop anything that we open up from the deep? Why would we release, you know, Cthulhu, metaphorically speaking? We cannot control that. And it's, yeah, I could keep going, but I'll let others ask questions.
I have a question regarding indigenous populations in these areas. And I had the great opportunity to attend COP26, and there were people from Kiribati and several Pacific islands that were speaking passionately about the immediate, you know, danger to their environment and lack of respect for their indigenous rights and their future. And I'm wondering what your exposure is to the indigenous populations there, what your relationship and understanding of their plight and fight for environmental justice is.
I mean, once you're here, everyone's indigenous. It's like the vast majority of who you're dealing with day to day in any given island community will be the indigenous population. And I mean, yeah, when there is so little land as a resource, it takes on added value in you know, relative terms. And you know, I've been reading through a bunch of the Marshallese folklore and history and talking about specific stretches of islands, and basically, you know, everywhere is a walk to the beach. You've got one path down the middle, and it's all partitioned off and named in various points. And a lot of those traditional naming structures are falling out of use or favor as migration occurs, as people are displaced for, you know, various reasons. And yeah, I mean, urbanization, it's the draw to services, the draw to goods, and it's mostly a product of the breakdown in the traditional communication channels across from community to community by vessels. And yeah, I mean, everyone, the concept of Vanua in Fiji, I mean, there are various Hanua and the other basically spirit of the land concepts across Melanesia and Polynesia and Micronesia are, I mean, they're indispensable. They're foundational in every sense, literary and figuratively. And yeah, they I would say that one of the best examples, if anyone wants to look at migration of communities, looking at the Springdale, Arkansas community in of Marshallese that have migrated, and it's over, I think, 20,000 out of, there are 57,000 at this point, 59,000 in the Marshall Islands. Huge percentage of the population, because of the Compact of Free Association, they're able to establish roots, but it's in the mountains, inland, and they've moved from this completely sheer against the sea existence. So displacement and I have to look up the word and I will circulate it later, but there is a specific word for that
John
type
had
of
a question
homesickness.
for you. I think I
Sorry.
overlooked him from the chat in the queue.
Mm-hmm.
John, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Andrea, Nona, Josh, for so clearly articulating all of the issues and all the problems happening in this area. I want to ask, I want you to put yourself in my shoes for a second. And I'm going to be going to the DNC meeting in September. That's my plan. I might get an opportunity to talk to say, let's just say, for example, I got 3 minutes with Jamie Harrison, 3 minutes with California State Party Chair, and 3 minutes with a senator. At the multilateral level, national level, and state level, what should I be telling them if I only have a couple minutes with them, and what is the most effective policies I can ask them to pursue?
Oh man. Well, one point I would raise, and it's something I've talked about, working with the State Department and the embassy here, is strengthening the channel between the Hawaiian state government and the State Department's embassies in the region. That's one piece of it, because the cultural connection is strong, like really strong. And that's the thing that needs to be fostered more than anything else. Like having there, it's really good from a technical perspective and sometimes a diplomatic perspective to have the people coming in from DC and the State Department pipeline into the embassies, but it's not strong enough. It should be triangulating with the Hawaiian state government because of the deeper Polynesian Triangle roots. That's one piece. If you say it in as long-winded a fashion as I will, you'll run out of time. I would say, this is supporting all of the decarbonization provisions in the IMO and strengthening the ICAO global market-based measures for decarbonization. Absolutely pivotal. RMI has been working as hard as they can with the Solomons. They've put up those papers, and the IMO is like everything creaky and out of date about the UN system. The IMO takes it up a level. So that is one point where the US can come out really, really strong and back the islands. Yeah, I mean, I think in the big piece of it beyond that, like I said, is that $100 billion a year commitment. Look at what the military spending budget, if that is reoriented towards mitigation and adaptation, it would make all of the difference. And it would mean geopolitical security with those states that it puts that level of thought and investment into. That's probably a little general, but I hope that was helpful in some respect.
No, that was helpful. And I think having the geopolitical stability framework is more convincing to these, DC people, for lack of a better word.
Saving
and
$1,000 later. That's the premise right now. It's preventative spending. That's the way to think of it.
And I do want to make sure those communication lines are stronger. So maybe I'll try to get a meeting with the Hawaii party chair.
Yep.
Can't promise anything, but I'm going to put my email in the chat box, and you can just send me an email with those 3 different things, and we'll see what we can do.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, you can reach out. Well, we can follow up after the meeting.
Yeah.
I just want to add, and I can get you that information, John, that there are 15 state democratic environmental groups that are officially attached to the state party, to the Democratic State Party, as we are the ECCC as a part of the DA. There is one for Hawaii.
Yeah, there is.
I can put you in touch with that, with the chair of that group, if that's helpful.
Yeah. Oh, and also Alaska. I mean, we've already done the, it was the coral and ice webinar sessions with the Marshallese government. So we've reached out to some of those organizations, some of which in Canada, some of which in Alaska. But if Alaska has a similar counterpart, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, there's also an environmental, I forget if it's a caucus or a council, but one of those two as well. So yeah, just send me an email, and I definitely want to talk with them about this if I can get their ear for a few minutes.
Great, that would be
in September. Yeah.
Christine, before we head out, it's getting close to an hour and a half, and I just wanted to make sure Christine had written in the chat. Did you want to add something or ask a question? Did Christine leave?
Sorry, I had my microphone off. I think it's kind of, this topic has been kind of not discussed, but kind of in different terms, it's been discussed already. In terms of how to get, I think as John was saying, and as Andrew was saying, and also David, I think also said earlier, that how to get these issues up on at a forum or at a level where it's actually of concern to not just the region itself, but to larger players, right, on the larger international stage. Like, I know that the Pacific Islands Forum, I think that's the current one that's in play right now, PIF, and also the Pacific SIDS, which is the block at the UN, that those are the main bodies for Oceania. But I don't know, from my experience, I tend to see that Oceania is lumped together with Asia, and obviously very different issues and very different, focus areas. So I don't know how these issues are, or the area itself can be raised to a higher level so that it's of more importance so that other larger economies see the importance of the region to them, and so they move away from this kind of benevolent aid and moving into more economic focused aid or assistance. So that was just, I'm not expressing myself very well, but kind of, I think that this is a topic that's been discussed.
You just made me think of this old Theodore Thomas sci-fi story called The Weatherman, where they've basically redistributed all of the world by latitude, longitudinal grid spots. And there's a Tongan diplomat in this story that is able to exercise overarching influence, irrespective of size of the country in the world. And so it is right now, we keep talking about in these discussions around the moral high ground. It is an imperative as part of humanity. We have, the UN agreed, okay, here is where we draw the line. Here are these rights that everyone is entitled to. And that means looking out for them across all borders and boundaries. So, sorry, that is, I think, the way to approach it continually is there's no alternative. This is what this region says, like they're in the trenches on the front line, getting bombarded by the sea that should not be encroaching.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I do agree that the moral high ground is something that has to be a focus. But then I look at the US, for example, and I see, does the moral high ground exist in the current system that we have right now? Is Oceania, is the Pacific a focus for the US policy?
I mean, well, most Americans could not name any other country besides Fiji because of the water. Like, no one could point to Samoa on a map. It is not something that is of any concern to people who have domestic issues afoot. And, with whatever percentage of Americans don't have passports, they are not going to be voting based off of the environmental fidelity of island nations.
Exactly.
So, yeah, John, none of that will be helpful in your conversations with the vote buying.
Oh, go ahead, Andrew. I was going to say that, taking from you, Christine, the idea of that moral high ground might one argument to use is the extinction of people, because you lose the culture. We've got an issue here in New Zealand with our Pacifica communities. As they arrive here, by the time we've hit the second generation, they're losing the language. And by the time we're in the third generation, language and culture is disappearing. And trying to hang on to that in really New Zealand is, you know, we are a Commonwealth country with the British, you know, with the Queen as our head of state, and as a consequence, the sort of anglicized culture here is the dominant culture, and therefore, as Pacifica people enter here, they have to work quite hard to hang on to their culture. That's just the Pacifica peoples that come here. We're looking at the extinction of thousands of language. Micronesia in itself, just Micronesia, has, I think it's Micronesia, yeah, has over 1,000 languages. They're going to all disappear. So perhaps from that moral high ground, when we're talking about the extinction of flora and fauna from the oceans, and we can also talk about the extinction of people, and do we have a responsibility to ensure the survival, the cultural survival and the linguistic survival of these, you know, thousands and thousands of languages, absolutely thousands. You walk into these spaces, and this is another thing to do with perspective. There's a tendency in the English language to denote these languages as dialects. By calling them a dialect, we've already made them inferior, when in fact they are whole languages by themselves.
And well, this is part of why I mentioned the academic opportunity for basically setting up national laboratories, is allowing, you say, wait, don't worry about it. Stop cutting down your trees. You know, Princeton and Harvard and Yale have put together a trust, and they're going to fund this giant linguistic study, and everyone who's participating, hey, you all speak that language. Here, sit down with me for a while. It'll be worth your time. Instead of, you know, this is sustainable exercises in education and human development. That's the kind of stuff that we could be spending money on. The money is there. We just don't spend it on that.
That's right. So I think, Christine, in order to reach that moral high ground, there has to be an entire shift in perspective. The way people understand and view Oceania is not the way, in the United States, is not the way the residents of Oceania view themselves. And likewise, the idea that there's 1,000 languages in the Micronesian islands, there's a tendency in the West to view those as just a bunch of dialects and therefore not so important. But in fact, that term dialect is an English invention. It's an English language invention to subordinate other languages. So it's all part of that mindset. And so, like Andrew's saying, we've got to shift, you know, we have to shift a mindset in order to attain that moral high ground. How do we get there? Education. It's just got to go through education.
These are profound concerns and thoughts to leave us with. We promised an hour-and-a-half event. We've gone a little bit over. I have learned so much. I will never refer to the area as the Pacific Islands again. I really have to thank Nona for that. You have really enriched, I think, all of us today. Josh and Nona and Andrew, I think all of you can join us in giving a big hand. Thank you very much. And I hope that you all will stay involved with the ECCC, be in touch with, you are Americans abroad as well, be in touch with John in Japan. He is the new Asia Pacific representative to the DNC for you.
Maybe it should be Asia Oceania, Dana.
Well, officially it is called AP, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Asia Oceania. So you have a amazing warrior in your court to help fight for our issues within the Democratic committee and by extension to our government. So I would take you up on that. And I hope that we will definitely be staging climate cafe forums every month on different themes. And we invite you also to join us for those and to continue the dialogue with us. If you would like to volunteer, any of you, to volunteer with us, we need volunteers in communications, in watchdogs research, and in planning events. We welcome new members, we welcome new volunteers, and please sign the petition that will go to Washington, which Angela has put in the chat before. She'll put it in the chat again. The petition that was included in our resolution in the global meeting. And have a great summer everywhere, or whatever season it is, wherever you are. I guess New Zealand is going into winter. I'm in Finland. I forgot to mention that I'm calling in from Finland. So I'm really could not be on the, more of the opposite side of the world from the rest of you. So thank you for joining us today. And hope to see you.
Thanks very much for having us.
Unity is strength, Dana. Thank you so much.
Thanks for hosting. Bye.
Thanks for hosting.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye.